next item with perfect timing. We're on item number 9, and warm welcome, Mr. Mayor and Mr. Deputy Mayor. It's lovely to have you here, and perfect timing for our C40 cities membership. And John, you are
Kia ora.
with your complex morning.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair. Kia ora, ko John Morrow of Takuangoa, ko Taku Toronga, he Chief Sustainability Officer, aho. We're talking about C40 right now, and I think we've got a bit of a slide deck to pull up. With me is Dr. Perrin Rafi-Thompson, who's contributed to the report and actually is pretty monumental in getting this across the line. So,
sorry, we're just having
okay.
a little issue.
We could do some tap dancing. So look, this is something you probably read because that's what happens with our papers. I just wanted to take you through a high level of kind of the big picture here and really encapsulate with a few supporting pieces of evidence why this might be a good idea. So before we get in there, I think what is C40 Cities? Well, we're a member already. We've been a member for 3 years. And this is almost standard protocol for us to reapply after 3 years as an innovator city. Just to remind you, we are one of these cities alongside Los Angeles, Guangzhou, Melbourne, Sydney, London, the mega cities of the world. Oh, look, we've got visuals. Okay, great. And actually, when we were putting this together, it was quite interesting that C40 Cities on their website has this beautiful city profiled right on the homepage. And if you look a little closely, you can see the Sky Tower and you can see the Waitemata. And that's us right there. And of course, the mayor speaking at a mayor's summit and a group of mayors off to the right. Like I just said, this is what C40 Cities is. We've been a member for 3 years. I don't think I need to dwell too much on that, except for one slight change to membership, and that is a requirement that we align our work with a report called Deadline 2020 and the aspirations of the Paris Agreement to achieve a 1.5 degree maximum temperature increase. So there's some new scientific evidence out there too. We don't need to go down this rabbit hole, but I think suffice to say, the conversation has shifted. So we were talking about 2 degrees, that was the Paris Agreement with a hope to get to 1.5. And the global body that's really the standard recognized authority on this has said, you know, 2 degrees is actually quite scary, destructive, and potentially catastrophic. So we need to start shifting the conversation to 1.5 degrees as a maximum increase in temperature. So I think it's worth noting that here at this decision. Of course, locally, we're doing some work to model that, to look at what that looks as part of our climate action plan. And that report that we need to align to suggests that cities need to do a rapid transition to that 1.5. Just to give you a sense of what this looks like comparing 1.5 to 2 degrees in terms of warming, I guess the upshot is it's not really that pretty either way. The left might be a little bit tiny to read, but it's part of that attachment that the independent advisory group sent along. The right, just to walk through a couple of the top lines here, wow, heat waves, heavy rainfall, crop yields, and sea level rise are actually markedly different between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And it's sort of the choice is sort of, well, it's bad or really bad at this point. I think the consensus is let's aim at worst for just bad. Of course, as a nation, we are moving in that direction. And I guess there's referencing your personal anecdote, Madam Chair, just came from hospital with my child who has a wrist cast now at 3 years old. This isn't kind of a matter of putting a cast on something and hope it heals. This is actually something that's quite substantial and requires significant efforts across all nations, including ours, and cities. So you'll see on the left the pathway to get down quite considerably. It means some pretty big moves as a nation, planting incredible amounts of trees, rethinking what we do with our land use, and electrifying our transport are sort of the things we need to actually start getting our head around to do at a national scale. And of course, there's a number of scenarios, and we don't need to walk through the graphs and whatnot, but just to give you a sense that this is going to take some significant effort, that we're aligned with government on this because this is their ambition, and this is actually something that they've been quite actively working on through the Zero Carbon Bill. and that the submissions that have come back, particularly those from Auckland, are quite supportive of that. About 93% actually support that aspirational target of 1.5. Of course, we're busy at work on our own plan across sector with some of your time and efforts through workshops with Mana Whenua, with private sector organizational leaders, and as I mentioned before, the mayoral appointed independent advisory group. And we're looking at what this means for Auckland, what kind of pathways will actually get us there, and how we work with central government to do that. The plan is really a vehicle to deliver on that commitment that we have to C40, to deliver a compliant plan. And I think just to note that all cities are moving in this direction now through the C40s network, and we're maybe not way ahead of the curve here, but integrating a response to climate impacts and anticipating emissions reductions. That's something that's done together more and more now, and that's what we're doing as part of our plan. I'll also note that in the private sector, about half of the emissions of New Zealand are represented in the New Zealand Climate Leaders Coalition. We are also part of that coalition as well, alongside AT, Panuku, and Watercare. And that's added impetus and actually supporting us to get this done at a local level. So what do we get from C40? Well, we don't pay a fee, and we get things like tailored research, technical assistance, training, assistance to subject experts across the CCOs and council family. We are resourced by C40 on that advisory group that the mayor and councillors you've set up for us. They profile our work, they give us a platform on the global stage, and in the development of our plan, they've actually helped us circumvent a ton of work we'd have to do by glomming on to what they've already produced from cities around the world. So we've got that best practice. That was our starting point from the development of the plan. This is in the paper, but just to set aside here, there's some risks to not joining or rejoining, and of course there are some risks to joining as well. Again, most notably, I'll draw your attention to the reputational risks. You know, we've done a lot with C40. A lot of you, including you, Mr. Mayor, have stood up and declared some significant leadership on the global stage, and C40 has been our platform for that. And if suddenly we weren't there, it might be a bit of a risk, reputation risk, as that kind of leader. Of course, there's a risk to our destabilizing the alignment with central government on this work, which is quite tight right now. There are resourcing risks that we won't have as much to work from in terms of the tailored research and work that C40 does really for us and with us. And of course, there's risk to momentum that we're building as part of that climate plan that we've kept you involved with the last year. Ultimately, that means risk to infrastructure, assets, and things to council if we're not able to get across that as well. The risk to rejoining, really that we have to have an ambitious plan. Of course, note that all other C40 cities in the Asia Pacific have committed to this. And it requires us to have steady progress. It requires us to actually work hard on this. I think finally here, just the next steps operationally, we transmit the materials, C40 reviews them, it goes to their steering committee, and we get information December on whether or not we're still part of C40 if you so choose to vote in agreement. Unsuccessful cities will be notified and actually cease being members in April. And then we'll continue developing that plan, doing the modeling, and just to note that we'll be back in December with that modeling, a framework, and a set of actions to give you a flavor of how we're going to achieve that target. And I think that is it.
That's fantastic. Thank you, John, and thanks, Perrin. And John, I just want to acknowledge you. I think any of us thinking of presenting such a coherent report after dealing with a 3-year-old breaking their risk, I think respect to you and your commitment to climate change and your team for being here. So
thank you.
Just from me to you, well done. Now I know there will be questions, and I'm sure the Mayor will speak to this, but just by way of a preliminary comment, the world stage that C40 offers to Auckland, I think is extraordinary, and I think it is. Climate change is certainly I think it's been said now by numerous politicians, our nuclear-free moment, and certainly Auckland, as a third of New Zealand, cannot stand by and not take up our full responsibility to be at the forefront of climate change, both mitigation and avoidance. And C40 gives us the tools and gives us the the peer support to work on that alongside with other cities. So I'm certainly exceedingly hopeful that this will be well supported, and that allows us in this term, and certainly the Mayor in this term, and hopefully next term, to carry on this important work. So any questions first before we just take comments? It's all pretty straightforward. Member Blair.
Kia ora, John. Just with reference to C40 have recognised the leadership potential of Auckland in terms of the role of Māori. So do you know what this is based on, and how it's going to be leveraged or actioned?
Through the chair, that's a great question that would be probably quite useful to have a conversation with you, Member Blair, and Member Brown about how to do this well. In conversations with C40, relatively informal conversations, they've noted that we are a unique nation, and they've sought to think how they can apply lessons learned from how we do this to the global stage. I'm not going to propose a way of doing that. We've kept you quite across the decision-making and conversations. We've been to the Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum a number of times. We've had hui with iwi and one-on-one conversations with iwi along the way. I'm not pretending we're doing it perfectly well, but we're definitely trying our hardest. And I think to take that lesson in plan development and implementation back to C40 as a case study and use that platform to talk about how this can be done in cities in North America, cities throughout the world, would be quite useful, and is actually a great way that we can not just pull from C40, but actually give back to the network.
Yeah, is my follow-up question also, but thank you, John, for your response. Is there a paper written on the impacts on iwi within our region with respect to the climate change pressures that they'll be experiencing?
So to my knowledge, there isn't a particular paper written right now. We've had conversations with the forum about how we might do that together, and that's a kind of a conversation in progress. I think we'd be interested in working with you on what that might look like.
Yeah, that'd be great, because they're having immediate effects at the moment in terms of, and with respect to people that I've spoken to, just even having our cemeteries located near the water, we're having to have significant decisions around this, and the cultural impacts and environmental and economic impacts on our people, where they're making decisions on how they're actually being buried now. So this is immediate, and we need bold and innovative action, because it is costing us in terms of our social and our cultural and our economic. So it'd be great to have a paper written on the position of climate change impacts on iwi. So how do we do that?
We've just been having a little discussion about that there, and we're really interested. You know, the role of the Independent Māori Statutory Board in this is critical, and the IMSB, together with the Mana Whenua Forum, we would love to see that work commissioned. IMSB can commission.
Yep, we'd welcome it.
Great. We've also had conversations at an officer level with Brandy and her team. We've actually had a team-to-team conversation about this with the entire MSB. So we'll probably continue that conversation as well, and we'll seek to work with
Thank you, John.
Dean in the chair. Yep.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Newman.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the report. A couple of questions from me, just following on from Renata's questions. Has there been a paper that's been written for the primary industry sector to explain how meeting the Paris commitment will affect farming?
So we've had a number of, I think what we're trying to do is get outside of papers, just to be honest, and actually engage with people in the industry. And so aside from the conversations we've had with the Rural Advisory Panel, we convened last week a group of representatives from primary industry to talk specifically about those concerns they have, the actions we might be proposing, and how we work together to deliver them. My guess is that we'll end up in some sort of supportive evidence report that we use to make the decisions and consider through this committee the direction we take. But we've taken that steer quite seriously from you and quite notably from the Deputy Mayor and Mayor as a necessary piece of work.
think that's a no, but I take that on advisement.
So,
But why?
I mean, I guess, no, we don't have a paper to show you about that work. There are a couple things going on at this time. There's the government's approach that we're closely following and trying to work together on, because they're looking at all of New Zealand impacts on primary industry, which frankly is larger than Auckland, not just spatially, but in terms of percentage of action needed. And we think through the ways that we've been engaging all sectors so far, the results we've gotten from that have exceeded expectations, and actually the value from that is more than a report. So I think we're...
Okay, well, I've got another question, just following on from that. So what work is proposed or has been commenced to assist primary industry transition, noting that the council has resolved support for a zero carbon approach, and that doesn't include a carve out for short-lived emissions from primary industry. So what work are we doing to support that transition?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. I think this is a bit of a chicken and egg conversation, to be frank. We're asking for direction, and we're preparing a plan, and we're working with cross-sector of industries doing modeling across all sectors, and we'll come back in December to present some of that to you. So while I can talk about specific conversations we've had and work we've done, it's not been formalized. It's too early for us to sort of say exactly what we've come up with, because we're still actually doing the work, and we plan on starting to air that with you next month.
I think just, Councillor, I can see the question you're asking, just to remind people, on the 4th of December at next month's Environment and Community Committee, we will have the start of the discussion on our climate change action plan. It might be good between now and then to do some work so that those questions of yours can be answered.
Two more questions, Chair, then, if that's
Just trying to
okay
be
with
helpful.
you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think one of the key gaps here is actually emissions from the built environment. So what work have we commenced, or what work will we be doing on advocacy to central government to incentivise new technologies to reduce emissions from commercial and industrial buildings, a major source of emissions, work which doesn't actually take place at the moment because we don't provide for depreciation deductibility. So is that covered in your work stream?
Yes, it is, Councillor. That's actually a pretty substantial piece of the work we need to do, so hopefully that's pleasing to you. I think there's two streams here. There's the advocacy to central government, which has actually been ongoing for before this term of council on things like the building code, and we've firmly stated what those positions are through politically approved position and submissions to government. The work we're doing now with industry around the built environment is very much like I described with the primary sector. We've brought together dozens of folks who represent the sector, including senior leadership. We started talking about what needs to change and what we need to do. Simultaneously, we've been doing a set of modeling on all sectors, including the built environment, which will be coming up for air again in December. So I'm in full alignment here. This is actually a really important piece for us to work on.
One final, if I may, and it's more of a language issue. In paras 13 to 15, we refer to the zero carbon bill. I don't think that the bill has been written yet, has there? There's no bill that I'm aware of, although that I've seen. I've seen a lot of discussion about the bill. I'm not sure that I don't support a bill that I haven't read, so should the language be changed here? Because I'm looking at the MFE website. The bill is yet to be drafted, or it hasn't been introduced. So shouldn't we be just being a little bit more cautious in terms of support for legislation that hasn't yet been written?
So, point well taken here. I think the language actually that we've used is the New Zealand government is progressing the zero carbon bill, which I don't think implies it's done. It's actually in progress. And if you go to the MFE website, you'll see where we are in that sort of set of process. they did consult, the largest consultation they've done, actually MFE has done in their history, with over 15,000 submissions received, including ours from this body. So as you'll know, it's a process that's ongoing. You're correct, it's not signed off and done yet, but the signals that they've been giving and actually the work that they've been doing has been quite transparent. So I'm a little confused on what needs to be clarified here. I think progressing indicates to me, at least, that we're not there yet.
I've got one comment, but I'll just leave it to the... Thank you. Unless no one else has anything.
Okay, no, I've got Councillor Walker with a question and
No,
Councillor Casey with a question.
I don't have a question. I've got some
Okay,
comments, so
all
I'll
right.
just make those at the appropriate time.
Jolly good. Councillor Casey, question.
Oh, I've got a question. I support this. John, my question relates to rolling out the obligations if we decide to go C40 again across council. And I'll give you an example. Recently at the Strategic Procurement Committee, we looked at the fleet, and the Auckland Low Carbon Network came to public forum to remind us. Can we be reminded without the public having to come in and do it? Is there going to be a way in our reporting that we look at climate change impact instead of, councillors putting their hands up or the public coming in to tell us? Is that on your radar?
Yeah, I think the quick answer through the chair is yes, and probably a couple things. One is the New Zealand Climate Leaders Coalition, of which we're a member, requires us to do things like report our emissions, have a target, and influence our supply chain. And so as a business, and alongside AT, Watercare, and Panuku, we've signed up to that. Where the rubber hits the road inside the organization, it's complex. We're starting to pilot that kind of approach in terms of climate impacts, for instance, with the parks team, as a way to see, can we do something that's nimble, efficient, doesn't add extra process, and actually gets us a better outcome? And I'd love to have the chance to come back and report to you how that worked.
Right, and can you just confirm that all CCOs will be it will involve all CCOs? You keep mentioning
Yes.
just...
So I mentioned those three in council because these are the chief executives that have signed up to that chief executive coalition across New Zealand of businesses and organizations. Others are welcome to join at any time, I understand. And the governance we'd like to set up, nimble, easy, is just to make sure that at a regular interval, those ELTs and CEOs get together and talk about how we're tracking on all of that. And I know Dean and Stephen and I have had those conversations about how we do that well and efficiently. I think the first go at that is the end of this month, so we'll see how that progresses.
Can I just have another question through the chair? Rather than inviting, should we not be telling?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's either we're doing it or we're not doing it. It's not, we're doing it, but you guys can, do your own thing.
I think that's, point well made, Councillor Casey, and I think we almost need to park some of this discussion, and then next month on the 4th, when we actually have our climate change action plan, which we will have a good chunk of time for, and amongst the huge agenda that is the 4th, I'd like to see us pick up some of these wider issues, but I agree with the point you're making. I think those might be the questions. Remember Blair, last
sorry, I
question?
missed the
Oh, and Cashmore.
Would you like to go? Oh, just one question there, John. There's an independent advisory group, as I understand, appointed. How does that tie in with this C40?
Yeah, thank you, Member Blair. I neglected to mention that directly. So I was recommended to send to you last night a letter from that group. It's a page and a half, and that group was appointed by the mayor and the committee chairs and deputy chairs and the IMSB. And those 7 representatives, including C40, although they've abstained from joining that letter because there could be a perceived conflict of interest because we're asking them to join C40.
So just, sorry to interrupt,
Yep.
there is representation from Māori on that?
Yeah, there is, out of those 7 members, 2 are distinctly chosen because of their connection to Māori issues, including Rhys Jones from the University of Auckland and Maria Barg from Victoria. Yep. And you'll see that letter of support for this ambition in your pack.
Cheers. Thank you.
Blair, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. John, I noticed you said you talked about the bill in Parliament is progressing. If you're coming to us next month with an action plan, how well are you going to be able to align that with what the government is expecting of us?
I'm just thinking about how long we have for this committee meeting. I think the quickest answer I could deliver, Mr. Deputy Mayor, is ongoing, almost daily conversations at an officer level with those working on this at MFE give me some degree of confidence that whatever direction they go, we've tied our boats together in terms of how we're going to deliver for Auckland. So it will be done in the context of wherever the central government goes. We'll be needing to both work with and respond to that direction. It's anyone's guess what that will be.
Degree of caution, but it might be well worthwhile, Madam Chair, depending on where this actually lands. I understand from the government that there is considerable variances across the coalition about where that might be and how that might be.
Through the chair, can I just add, I think the opportunity here, so I think that it's a good word of caution that we keep the streams quite close. I don't think it precludes us from doing our homework and progressing through this committee a suggested approach. I mean, in a way, if we have to kind of back off and go less ambitious, then that's a lot easier than saying, how do we dial this up? So I guess through this vote, we would get the signal from you that, you know, go hard, keep doing the work, and then if we have to pull back, we can choose to do that.
Yep. We want to travel in parallel fashion
Right.
with the government.
Exactly.
Okay, so now we've gone questions answered, comments. Councillor Walker.
Sure, just want to make a few comments. I'm totally supportive of our joining C40. I'd suggest it's a no-brainer. The reputational risk would be not a place that we want to go. There's a few comments that I'll make that aren't in the report that I think add to it. And the first one is the leadership role of Auckland Council in New Zealand. We're the only New Zealand city in C40 and likely to be the only one. And quite obviously, as much and all as we're able to get resources from C40, our role on LGNZ and our role with other cities enables us to then disseminate that information to other cities. So we're not just there for Auckland, frankly we're there for New Zealand. If it's also accepted globally that it is cities that are the activists around climate change rather than countries, and I don't want to go there, then it's even more important for us to have that role. I'd also note that we've got a membership of ICLEI, which is a related organisation to C40, and they're complementary, and that relationship that other cities are also involved with enables us to have further dissemination. The other thing I'd spell out that I think is incredibly important about C40 is a lot of these other cities in C40, as much and all as they're bigger than New Zealand, are also very similar. So we benefit phenomenally. The other point that I'd make that goes to this is that C40 is essentially subsidised. It's subsidised by Bloomberg and others, some large net worth individuals and companies. So that's something that should not be just put to one side. The subsidies are phenomenal and they're growing. The other concern that I've got, and sure it's mentioned in here around the IPCC report, frankly the latest IPCC information is already out of date. We know that very significant information around the role of the oceans as heat sinks has been grossly underestimated, and that the consequence is that global warming is in a even more precarious state than we've known before. And almost every bit of data that is coming out on a weekly, a monthly basis is indicating that. So the other concern that I've got, Madam Chair, goes to not just our membership of C40, but our resourcing climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, the woefully lacking budget in that area and the immediacy of it, and the particular concern that I have that I raise often around the need for scenario planning across transport, across many of our decisions. And the reason I ask for that is it is glaringly obvious now that many of the assets that we are investing in increasingly are going to be stranded assets. they're going to be worthless in the future because they're being put in places where climate change, sea level rise, storm surge, all of these related things are going to have a huge impact. And I would suggest that we need risk analysis across any number of projects. And that would also enhance our understanding in the immediacy. And the people of Auckland need this because they are making investment decisions, and we have propositions from companies making investment decisions, frankly, that will not be substantiated within a very short space of time.
Thank you, Councillor.
So I go back to my prime point. Yes, we need to join. We need to do it now.
Thank you. Couldn't agree more. All those points. Absolutely. Councillor Newman.
Yeah, a couple of concerns, I guess. And it's not necessarily about our membership of this organisation. It's about the practical application of changes that I think are necessary, but which are going to be quite difficult to progress, in part because of a lack of understanding and disjointed thinking, probably more to do with central government, Chair. As I recall, we gave our support to a policy direction on the 10th of July on the relation to the zero carbon bill. The zero carbon bill has been reflected here. It is apparent that the government hasn't addressed the issue of depreciation deductibility in its consideration of that bill, because actually it's been a proposal from the tax working group that we have depreciation deductibility only for residential. Well, what about all the other non-residential commercial industrial property types? They haven't been addressed. There is a whole stream of work in the tax space which is not aligning with work in the zero carbon space, I would suggest, and that needs to be resolved. I think that from the perspective of what is being proposed here with work that's been referred to by Mr. Morrow, I would suggest that the council needs to be very clear in its forward advocacy that we need to have full depreciation deductibility across all property classes to reduce gas emissions within the built environment. A big contributor to reducing our carbon footprint. Secondly, it is absolutely essential that we get information back about the consequences of achieving the Paris commitments and how that will be paid for by the farmers, because 80% of Auckland is rural, and I would suggest that the primary industries potentially are going to take a hammering in order to pay for the Paris Agreement. I think that will make some farming operations uneconomic, and maybe they shouldn't be viable if they're not investing in new technologies. But the fact that we're not providing support for a carve-out for short-lived emissions, I think, is a problematic thing, and I didn't vote for our support for that bill on that basis. A third thing I would say, Chair, is that I just think that we should be careful not to hang our hats on the zero carbon bill per se, because the bill hasn't been written. As the Deputy Mayor has pointed out, there is debate within the coalition. I'm not surprised, because it goes fundamentally to who pays the cost of transformation, and I'd suggest that the costs will be paid, one, by primary industries, and two, by New Zealanders who are far less resilient than half the people in this room, and that the economic cost to my constituents is something that needs to be fully understood. So I acknowledge that this is a recommendation that's going to be endorsed overwhelmingly. Who wouldn't want to be on the side of the good news in relation to action on climate change? But the actual cost of transition is something that is not being presented, and it will need to be presented, and I look forward to more specificity emerging in December, because I'll be looking for that and asking questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Remembering, Councillor Newman, there are two sides to that ledger. Mayor Goff.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, John, to you and your team for the paper. This paper asks us to endorse reapplication to be a member of the C40 cities, and that's required every 3 years because we don't qualify by virtue of our size. We qualify by virtue of our leadership and our preparedness to be innovative. And I'm proud that we're a member of the C40, and I think that C40 is really important to us in terms of us being able to achieve the high standards that we must achieve. There's only two reasons why anyone would vote against this resolution. The first is that you don't think there's a need because you don't really believe in climate change. And yes, there are a few people that think that. They're diminishing, they're discredited, they're speaking against the overwhelming weight of scientific opinion, and I hope that nobody here would want to be associated with that particular group, the most prominent member of which is the President of the United States. The second reason why you might not want to agree with this resolution is if you don't think we can do it. And I need to tell everybody here now, considering this motion, that to achieve the goal of 1.5 will be hard. It will be a stretch. But if we don't stretch, we won't get there. And when I was a kid, I guess one of the things my parents taught me is that it's better to try and fail than not to try at all. We'll have to work really hard. I'm not accepting that we'll fail. I think we can and we must do it. But if we don't accept that target and we give up now, the cost will be immense. You know, we're not talking about something that simply has an environmental impact, though that environmental impact is really severe. We're talking about something that will have a massive social and economic impact on our country, our city, and the world as a whole. And Paris signed up to 2% because that was the best they could do, given the mood at the time. Every report since then says, actually, we've got to do better than 2%. We've got to go for 1.5. And I think we have to set that as a target. Looking at what the Minister for Climate Change has said, I know he believes that that is what we have to do. And we need to have that as a goal to stop the huge costs that will follow. There's some people that say, you know, look, it's too hard right now, let's put it off, let's do it later. The later we leave, the worse the problem will become and the more expensive that it will be. It's a bit like having a wound that needs an operation that will be life-saving and say, oh, I don't want to undergo an operation, I'd rather put a Band-Aid over it and pretend that it's not there. I'm not into that world, I'm not into that thinking. And to be fair to what we are doing, we've made some really big progress. Last year I was asked to sign the fossil fuel-free streets declaration. And I didn't just stroll into it to say I want to be part of the cool crowd. I first asked the question of Auckland Transport, can we do it? And they said it'll be a stretch, but we can. They started thinking about it, and they told all of us just a couple of weeks ago that they are on track to not purchasing any public transport vehicle after 2025 that is other than low emission. So you set the target and then you find a way to realise it. And that's what I believe we have to do. We have to change, and we are changing on transport, public transport, electric transport. We're changing to a more compact city that will have less impact on climate warming. We're starting to accept the green building accreditation process. And, you know, it was great to open some apartments the other day that were 10-star. You know, they're not contributing to emissions. It's really important that we achieve not only the Million Trees program, but we go on and set a higher target. It's really important that we work with the agricultural sector because it can't bury its head in the sand either. I know it's going to be tough, but there are solutions and we have to find them. And we're doing it on waste. So my belief is, first, we have to do this. We have to achieve 1.5, And secondly, yes, it'll be hard. Yes, it'll be demanding. Yes, it will require some hard decisions. But this isn't optional. Actually, it's critical. It's necessary. And I endorse what Wayne Walker said and what our chair has said about this. Auckland needs to be a leader. We might only be a small percentage of it, but in terms of the carbon emissions we're creating, we create more than most of humanity, and that we've got to think about our obligations. We need to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So I endorse the recommendations, and I hope that this council strongly supports it.
Thank you. So if you're happy to move, Mr Mayor, I'm happy to second.
I so move, Madam Chair.
Okay. I've got Councillor Hills and then Deputy Mayor Cashmore. Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and apologies, I was just at an Auckland Transport meeting and I lime scooted to and from and saved 600 grams of carbon by doing so according to the app. But I just want to say quickly that obviously I support this, but we are probably moving too slow as a country, as a city, as a world, and we keep kicking the can down the road. California's on fire right now. That's not happening by accident. We have large swathes of our coastline being either ruined or inundated already. We're sort of 10 to 20 years away from serious issues, and we're not really looking at, we're looking at mitigating and fixing things up every now and then, but actually we're failing, I'd say, on most grounds. To the coalition documents with the government, both the New Zealand First Labour document and the Labour Greens document both say they're committed to the Zero Carbon Act and the Climate Commission, so that's in both documents and they're all working together on that. So the government is more aligned than ever before, and so I think that cities is where the heart is really at it. Our carbon issues for Auckland, obviously agriculture is about what, 7% or 5 to 7%. The majority of the fault in Auckland is emissions, and while the lofty goals, obviously we need the rest of the world to catch up to, it's the things that are coming out around air quality, around issues around flooding, around our environment, our health of our younger and older people who are more susceptible to carbon-related emissions. So it's not just about the big goals of reducing the heat of the world, but it's also our own environment that we are cleaning up. So I think that if we don't act and we don't act fast, I think we're going to be too slow. It's a bit sad that we managed to do the whole new network with brand new buses from all over the world that are mostly diesel and petrol, so we're going to have to wait for those. But if we don't speed up, then I think we can't be following the rest of the world. So cities are where it's at. If we don't stand up and take the lead, especially as the New Zealand's largest city, then I think we're failing the whole country. So I think this is pretty obvious. I still think that us and the world are probably moving too slow to actually make a real difference in the next 50 to 100 years. I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, if it ever gets better. So this is one step to do that, but I think all of our departments and everyone in Auckland, private and public, needs to be actually acting on this, because it's not something that is a pie-in-the-sky idea, or we don't need 97% of scientists to be telling us it's true. You just need to look out the window and across the world to the serious issues we're facing, especially our Pacific cousins across the water who are slowly losing their homes. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Harrison. Just before I go to Councillor Cashmore, I spent last Friday with the biotech industry working in the dairy side of things, which is the industry I used to work in. And the work that's being done by the dairy industry and the biotech industries associated with them is amazing. And just before people, or condemn the dairy sector and our farming sector as the greatest cause and the greatest problem, and the people that we need to sort of defend, I just want to acknowledge the work that's being done through better herd management, through better disease management, and through better feed. The potential to reduce carbon, greenhouse gas emissions is huge. I mean, your average dairy herd reducing emissions by 5% is 33 cars off the road. So, the dairy industry is working on this, and I don't think we should be nervous about engaging with some of the C40 targets and the stretch targets because the good part of the agriculture industry is right there with us and need to be held to account and worked with, rather than used as an excuse not to support the stretch targets. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
No one's doing that.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And all parts of the agricultural industry are good, Madam Chair. It's just there's some miscreants amongst those parts, as there are in every industry throughout the country and the world. I'm supporting this simply because it's the right thing to do. Agriculture's emissions are a big part of this country's emissions. There's no two ways about that. But given the tools to overcome those emissions, we will do it. And we've already invented some of those tools. We're just not allowed to use them in this country because of legislation. And perhaps that legislation what needs to be changed rather than having to reinvent new and other tools. Also, given an incentive, agriculture, whether it's livestock, cropping, horticulture, can do its work. I well remember the 80s when agriculture led the brunt of Mr Goff's Labor government movement for a free market. And we got given cold water. It was, tomorrow we have a floating exchange rate and subsidies are gone.
And you emerge stronger from it.
And the manufacturing sector got another 15 years. But then we just exactly right, Mr Mayor, within 3 years we had adapted. And in the livestock sector, what's happening right now, on our particular property, we have cut capital stock numbers by over 20%, but we have increased production per hectare by the same amount. So the goals can be achieved without fear and without remorse, but it does take a little bit of financial courage to have that crack. And that's sometimes the hard part. But given time, ag will adapt, and by God, it has to adapt for this country's sake, because 60% of this country's overseas funds come from farming, forestry or fishing. And without it, you not only will not have an economy in Auckland, you won't have one in this country. So we need to adapt, we need to make it stronger and better, and by gosh, I don't have any fear of facing that. And I don't think most of the agricultural sector does. From what I've seen of all the leaders of the sector have stood up saying, we're not in denial here, it's about how you do it, and if you give us a little bit of time to phase it in, we will get there. We want to be part of the solution, not against the solution.
Good on you, Councillor Cashmore, thank you. And last word to Councillor Cooper.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair.
Bill?
Yes, I did want to speak up because it's very easy to think, you know, there are people that think that I wouldn't support something like this, but I wholeheartedly do, and it's a little bit on the back of what Councillor Cashmore says about what your parents say to you. You know, aim high, fail big, and my school motto was seek the heights. And I actually think, even if you don't believe in climate change, I don't know who doesn't anymore, but who wouldn't want cleaner air, cleaner waterways, planting more trees to make more forestry or native trees to support our native bats. You know, also, you know, you look at the work that's been done, and Councillor House and I also visited an international company based in Henderson who actually do have got a trial farm up in Taupaki that actually basically they can reduce emissions from cattle by 25% just from the feed by analysing the grass in the paddocks and helping farmers manage the way they feed. And no genetics, no medicines, no vaccines. You know, it's entirely possible, and we've got it right here in New Zealand, a big international American family company. And I liken it a bit to how Douglas Pharmaceuticals started a family company that's now doing international work, great work that can be applied here. So, look, even if, you know, everybody does their very best and we don't get there, we still will achieve a lot and make our quality of life better and make our international products more saleable and acceptable. And I just think that if people worry about us wasting money on this, this is just a way to help us implement what we've already planned to do. And sometimes with sustainability, you might have to put a little bit of money up front, but you get much better results at the end. And I don't believe we're spending massive amounts of money on this. We're just doing our job, and we're doing it in a certain way. And that's where we get the returns for Auckland. And I think being 30% of New Zealand's population benefits Auckland, the whole country as well. So I do support this. I don't think it's a waste of money, and I don't even think it's a huge amount of money, but it's really well worth it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper. Gosh, I think our discussion on the 4th of December is going to be excellent. I'm going to put the recommendation. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you, members. That was a very, very useful discussion and debate. And John, take care of your little one. I hope the wrist heals. And Perrin, thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We'll move on to item number 10, and then we will take a break.